Today, we tend to think of Japan as a country relatively poor in mineral resources, so much so that its lack of metals and oil became one of the causes of World War II. But for a while, during the most violent and formative time in Japan's history, the course of events revolved around a sudden abundance of one natural resource, silver. In the late 1400s, what was left of Japan's central government, or shogunate, disintegrated amid a dispute over succession. That by itself wouldn't have been too unusual. Similar episodes in previous centuries had typically resulted in bloody but minor conflicts before another dynasty emerged. But this time it would be different. This time, a new government would come to power only after more than a century of near total anarchy that gave the period its name, Sengoku, or the time of the warring states. And the reason it was different? That was the silver. Before the Sengoku period, silver was considered a strictly Chinese commodity. Japanese merchants trading on the Asian mainland were well acquainted with the stamped silver ingots that their Chinese counterparts used for high-value commerce. But no silver deposits were known in Japan until, in the late 1400s, it was finally discovered that Japan was in fact home to numerous deposits of silver. Many of them had been sitting right in plain sight all along. Unlike the case for some other metals, most silver ores do not actually look like silver. Instead, they look like this. Even pure metallic silver, which forms a mineral on its own, will quickly suck trace amounts of sulfurous gases out of the air and acquire a black tarnish of silver sulfide. In at least one case, a Japanese copper mine in the 1400s had been operating for almost a century before anyone recognized that the ugly, heavy, blackish, yellowish rocks always getting in the way were in fact high-grade silver ore. Japan's supply of precious metals, heretofore too small to fight over, was a lot larger than anyone had thought. But the collapse of the central government around the time of this discovery meant that no one controlled the resource and it was open to all comers. A feudal feeding frenzy ensued. Warring lords opened new silver mines, fought over existing silver mines, and used the proceeds to fuel a vast expansion of their military capacity. Where previously the size of an army had been limited by the need to pay everyone in land or rice, samurai would now take payment in a few pieces of silver. Silver could pay for other things too, like the newfangled harquebus that Portuguese traders were bringing to Japan's ports. There ensued the most violent and tumultuous 150 years in the history of Japan. Thanks to the spread of silver mining, what had been small bands of samurai turned into large armies. Most of what they were fighting over was the silver mines, which by the 1530s had become the prime military objective of every warlord in the business. The contest for silver resources also led to an equally cutthroat competition in technological innovation and the importation of foreign methods and people. Expert miners were brought in from Korea, China, and increasingly Europe. Surface trench mining was abandoned in favor of diagonal shafts and stoping, taking mines deeper and production higher than ever before. Two imported Korean metallurgists replaced the old smelting techniques with cupellation, an improved process in which mixed metal ores are deliberately mixed again with lead and heated up in a cupel or crucible made from bone ash. Any metal whose atoms can bond with oxygen will snatch some out of the atmosphere and form a metal oxide, which then sinks into the bone ash and gets absorbed. Since silver and gold are both incapable of bonding with oxygen, they form a small puddle in the bottom of the crucible, which you can then solidify and retrieve. Cupellation made it possible to get silver out of ores that the previous smelting methods couldn't have handled. So more and more silver flowed into the lord's pockets, and from there to the samurai. And lords kept fighting over silver mines, competing to attract foreign metallurgists, and encouraged all and sundry to find and mine silver deposits everywhere on their lands. And as the fighting over silver supplies continued, chaos reigned. But silver, whose discovery had helped to start the anarchy, also slowly ended it as a few key lords accumulated a critical mass of Japan's precious metal resources. Eventually, these new supplies would enable them to unify Japan under a single strong central government for the first time in 200 years. The three warlords who leveraged silver to end the turmoil that it had also started are still revered in Japan as its great unifiers. The earliest, Oda Nobunaga, made a name for himself as an enterprising, if slightly crazy, young aristocrat with large ambitions and a penchant for explosives. In the 1550s, he succeeded his father as head of the Oda clan, though multiple relatives violently contested his leadership. After solving this problem by a process of elimination, so to speak, Nobunaga turned his attention to mining. The Oda lands contained little in the way of gold and silver mines, but there was enough to start with. Nobunaga enforced a series of technological and economic stimulus measures, managed to induce a large increase in their production, and this gave him the resources to hire more soldiers. A zealous importer of Western ideas and armaments, he secured a supply of harquebuses from the Portuguese and applied them to expanding his territory. This in turn brought him new mines and new lands, and he encouraged prospecting and new mining whenever a deposit was discovered. Soon he was distributing unheard of sums in precious metals to samurai who distinguished themselves in battle, enhancing their loyalty and enlarging his army. By 1575, he had wrested control of the highly productive gold and silver mines of central Japan away from their former owners, earning the nickname Demon King of Japan along the way. 5 years later, he was in control of most of Japan's land area and, crucially, most of its major mines. Nobunaga's reforms were not limited to involuntary adjustments of mine ownership. Recognizing the advantages of a monetized economy compared to barter, he forbade payments in rice and began collecting taxes and tribute in gold and silver. Some of the gold he sequestered himself for personal adornment and palace wallpaper, but he used much of his mine's proceeds to ensure that Portuguese firearms, mining expertise, and smelting technology kept coming his way. Under his technological and economic stimulus measures, silver production throughout most of Japan soared. The economy was well on its way to full monetization, and around 1580, it looked very much like unification would rapidly come to completion. In 1582, the unification process was briefly paused by Nobunaga's disembowelment, decapitation, and conflagration. But one of his retainers, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, picked up where Nobunaga had left off. After a brief pause for a bloody vengeance on his late lord's assassin, Hideyoshi resumed the efforts to unify Japan, under his rule, of course. He continued and extended most of Nobunaga's policies, requiring that all transactions be carried out in metal and instituting a standardized series of stamped ingots. He too rewarded samurai with gold and silver doled out in proportion to the number of enemy heads after each battle, and continued to expand and conquer old mines and encourage new ones to keep supplies coming. Along the way, Hideyoshi enhanced government power further by confiscating to his treasury as much as he could of the national metals supply. All gold and silver mines were declared mountains of the state and placed under the central government's direct control. A few trusted lords were allowed to continue managing mines on their own lands, but only if they paid its treasury between 1/4 and 1/3 of output as tribute. Silver and gold flowed into his treasury in increasing amounts. In one case, Hideyoshi's officials brought along 1.5 tons of gold and 3+ tons of silver as running money on a single local military expedition. Throughout his reign, Hideyoshi would continue Nobunaga's policy of stimulating mine production by any means possible and mandating the use of metal currency in place of a barter system. By the time he died in 1598, most Japanese were living in a silver-based money economy. The young Tokugawa Ieyasu applied many of the same tactics, conquering Japan's remaining land area with special priority given to provinces with a mining industry. Gold and silver mines continued to be government-run mountains of his state, especially after the required tribute had been upped to a third to a half of annual production. The Tokugawa shoguns took special care over their mines. In most spheres of Japanese life, they discouraged foreign involvement, and in 1639, the Sengoku edict would officially close the country to almost all outside influences. But mining was exempted. Foreign miners, metallurgists, and machinery continued to make their way onto the islands even during Sengoku, with the government's blessing. The otherwise cloistered Japanese government went to great lengths to secure foreign expertise and technology for mining silver and gold. When the outgoing governor of the Spanish Philippines was shipwrecked off the coast of Japan, Ieyasu had him brought for an audience at one of the mines. The two negotiated a proposal for the Spanish government to send over some 50 expert miners from Mexico, which at that time led the world in deep shaft underground mining techniques. The deal fell apart when they couldn't agree on how to split the proceeds. That was a problem because by then, Japan's economy, and with it the government's legitimacy, were almost completely dependent on a continuing and enlarging supply of silver. The Tokugawa shoguns were maintaining their power among the samurai through the distribution of silver gifts, maintaining a stable economy by supporting a strong silver currency, and maintaining a supply of armaments and a few foreign luxuries by paying foreign merchants in silver. Even during Sengoku, or the closed country time, Dutch and Portuguese ships brought silks, porcelain, spices, musk, and other goods to Japan, but as a chronicler had recorded earlier, they bring from thence nothing but silver. Production estimates are disputed, but it is virtually certain that in the early 1600s, Japan was mining and exporting several tens of tons of silver each year, and perhaps as much as 200 tons. By a relatively conservative estimate, Japan in the first half of the 17th century was the world's second largest silver exporter, after only the Spanish colonies of the New World. But that state of affairs proved unsustainable within a century. Mines were driving too deep for pumps to keep them from flooding, and production started to drop. But exports continued, sending so much Japanese silver to China and Europe that the domestic supply of coins was constantly running short. Confucian philosophers and Tokugawa government officials grumbled that exporting Japan's silver abroad was draining the nation's precious bodily fluids. As one put it, the reason that in recent years the spirit of the national land has become thinner and her people have deteriorated is surely that we have not preserved the gold, silver, copper, and iron that are the ultimate spirit of the mountains and streams of our land, but have shipped them to foreign lands, with, one presumes, grave consequences for the purity of essence. At any rate, in the later 1600s, the Japanese government first restricted silver exports and then banned them. But they could not keep mine production from falling or much of the silver from being smuggled out anyway. The money supply dropped and the population grew. By 1700 AD, the economy was in dire straits. In desperation, the Tokugawa government would spend the next century and a half cycling through currency debasement, reminting attempts, fiat currency, and other forms of financial seppuku that largely just made the economy worse. It was perhaps the general economic distress that put Tokugawa's descendants in an unusually receptive frame of mind when, in 1853, the Western world reappeared on Japan's doorstep carrying a crowbar. Immediately upon the country's forced reopening, the Japanese government began shipping in American and European mining engineers. After 1868, the Meiji government forced all mines to abandon what were now the old inefficient technologies and start using the new techniques. Silver production rose enough for a much-needed reform of the currency, which helped stabilize the economy. In echoes of Hideyoshi's declaration nearly 3 centuries earlier, a Meiji official of the time stated that the mines ought to be considered the country's most important industry. That, at least, had not changed.